Welcome to Clocked In, the podcast where work works for people, not the other way around. We're Kristen and Ashley, and every week we dive into what's really going on in today's workplaces. From hybrid headaches to hiring trends, culture clashes to quiet quitting. Whether you're an HR pro, a people manager, or just someone trying to make sense of your 9 to 5, we've got the conversations that matter and the strategies to help you build a better workplace. So grab your coffee, clock in, and let's get to work. Welcome to this week's episode of Clocked In. We're your hosts. I'm Ashley.
And I'm Kristen.
And this is episode 3 of our 4-part series on Gen Z. Today, we'll be continuing our discussion on what you should know about Gen Z in the workplace. So if you missed last week's episode, be sure to go back and listen or watch, as we'll be building on that information today. Our next article here, we have some kind of conversation around what does it mean to lead or work with Gen Z? How do you kind of make this generation more productive, more effective in the workplace? And the author really talks about reframing negative stereotypes as positives. And so I think that there are certainly opportunities to reframe, and we'll get into that here in a moment, but some things just have to be addressed, right? Like, it's the manager's job to tell someone, this is not matching our expectations of what we expect for workers. This is not professional behavior. And so sometimes there's a way to reframe, and sometimes you just need to set the expectation and then hold people to that standard as well. And I think some people just aren't coachable, right? Like, they will not take that feedback as a positive. They will not take it as a learning opportunity. They will not take it as an investment in their professionalism to help them grow in their career. And I've always thought you can't want it for somebody more than they want it for themselves. So sometimes there's certain behaviors that you just can't change in people, even though you've had the conversations, you've pointed it out, you've tried to help them think of a way forward. And some people just are not going to take that feedback. And you just have to know that as a manager as well. And they may not be the best fit for the organization in the long run. But let's talk a little bit about some of these stereotypes and how they could be reframed, kind of with this lens of knowing that not everything can just be reframed and we should just accept Gen Z as they are and nothing needs to be done differently. So Kristen, one of the ones that this author called out is that you can reframe the fact that Gen Z is constantly on their phones as they're willing to experiment and try new tech tools. So what do you think about that one?
As with most things, I had some pretty strong feelings about what she was saying, because I agree with her concept of let's reframe some of these things that we're seeing as negative and see how we can leverage them as strengths. But to your point, I think it's also about teaching them. And I think as a manager and even in higher education, we are responsible to the students that we have. We're responsible to the people that we lead, if we're a manager, to help them not only in their job, but to build the skills they need to be successful in the future. And I think if you don't address some of these behaviors, like always being on their phone, and if you just allow them to continually be on their phone, but be like, oh, how can we leverage it in other areas? That's a disservice, because somewhere else that they may not be able to do that, And so I think that it's, on one hand, absolutely look at their aptitude for technology and their willingness to use it. That is a strength, and say, hey, find me a new technology, or this is a new technology that we want to do. How can you embrace it and kind of grow it in it from that aspect? But I think kind of to your point earlier, it's a balance, you can't just let bad behaviors go. I always say, personality is not an excuse for behavior. And so just generational traits and and norms are not an excuse for behavior either. So I think for this article, she does call out a number of good things that could be a way to reframe it. I think it's just about finding what that balance is.
Yeah, and this generation is kind of known to be passionate about their perspectives. So we've talked a lot about the mental health conversations, more of activism. They're aware of different trends because of social media with what's happening around the world. And so this article suggested kind of reframing that, not as a negative, but seeing it as that they're willing to commit their heart and soul to work if passion and the job are aligned. And so we talked before about that desire for the values to be aligned, and that's an opportunity for companies to really highlight what they're about. And not just what they say they're about, but like what are those core values that they actually live out and how do they embody those in their culture? And then really thinking about, as an organization, how do we portray these to Gen Z to make them want to come to work for us, right? How can that be part of our employer brand so that employees want to be here? They understand what they're signing up for, not just in the specific job or role, but like overall, they are committing to this aligned work. And so I think this is a positive. Like, this is a way that companies can really use something that is often said about Gen Z in a way to make them stand out as a desired employer and really kind of align those things to help attract Gen Z.
Yeah, I thought this was a great example of using something that can maybe be seen as a negative, because think about if you can get a Gen Z employee to buy into what your company is doing and get them passionate about it, think about what a strength that could be for your company. So I think this was actually a very great example that she gave in this article of kind of reframing that and leveraging it as a strength for the company. I really liked that one.
And one of the other ones that stood out to me that I really liked was this changing the mindset around Gen Z wants constant praise to the kind of desire or need for consistent feedback. And so, like I mentioned previously, we shouldn't just be having feedback once a year in a performance review kind of system, but recognizing that that's beneficial for all employees. What are those check-ins? Like what are your stumbling blocks? How can I help you? What do you need from me to be successful at the task that I've assigned? Here's what you're doing well. Here's what I would like to see done better. Here's how you can grow in this position to the next one or to a different assignment or stretch opportunity. And so I think there's a lot of benefit across generations on this one if you really do kind of embody that feedback that is so important for a manager to give, regardless of the generation, knowing that you can't always give the bonus, you can't always give a raise or a promotion, but you can give a thank you, or you can give acknowledgement or a shout out in a team meeting or on Slack. You can recognize people's efforts in a way that would be helpful to them and improve their work quality as well.
Yeah, I agree. I thought this was another really good one that she called out in the sense that knowing if they are open to feedback and it's something that they really want, or even specifically maybe recognition more so than feedback, but how can you use that as a manager to encourage them to both do a better job and then recognize them to help keep them motivated, which can be so hard for any generation to keep them motivated. So I think this is a great way of looking at it of, oh, instead of they need constant feedback and validation, of how can you leverage it as a manager to keep them motivated and keep them doing a great job?
So those are some ideas for managers, for organizations, but let's flip it a little bit and let's talk about for Gen Z as we close out this episode. What can Gen Z do to help them kind of overcome some of these stereotypes that exist about them and the workplace? And so for this one, we have a Forbes article entitled Gen Z Careers the Worst to Manage, 45% of hiring managers say. So nearly half of hiring managers saying that Gen Z is the worst. So that's not great. So what can Gen Z do about that?
Yeah, so I think number one, and I talk to my students about this all the time, is that, and I flat out asked them one time, is like, why should you care what millennials think of you? And they called out because they are going to be our managers when we go into the workforce. And so 100% correct in that the perception that people have of you, it matters. And unfortunately, in this case, even though it may not be true, and I can think of more students than not where these stereotypes would not exist to, but I always tell them it's really important to acknowledge that these perceptions exist about you before you go into the workplace, so you can be intentional about showing that they're not true. So, for example, if everybody thinks, oh, you're Gen Z is just addicted to technology, they're detached, they don't care about what's going on, they just want to be on their phones all day, keep your phone away. Like, have intentional conversations. Do not be on your phone while at work, and show that that doesn't apply to you. And so number one, I would say, I don't know if this necessarily outlined in the article, but be aware that these perceptions exist of you and intentionally, kind of prove them wrong if they are something that are negative. But the article did call out a number of things that they could do is, one, of course, focusing on the technology, like flex your digital muscles, show that you are a fast learner and that you are willing to take on these new technology tools. I think you could probably do a whole other series about just AI and all the tools that are being used there. And so that could be a true strength and say, hey, I'm willing to learn this new technology. Let me have a crack at it and see what I can figure out. But then the second, which I think kind of goes to the perception piece that I was talking about, is, building a personal brand. And so I think going back to the technology piece, Gen Z is very much into social media and things like that. So they can use kind of that background to curate their own personal brand that could help them in the workplace. And I would say likewise, they could help the company build a brand that Gen Z would be attracted to as well. Number 3, I think that this is really important. So I think one of the challenges that we called out previously was kind of entitled behavior and lack of flexibility. But number 3 of this Forbes article says, adapt your communication style to older generations. I think that this is really important, and not even just for Gen Z, but that we should all be adapting our communication styles to those that we work with. And I do think that it is a two-way street, but especially as a Gen Z individual first starting out their career, being able to adapt your communication style to an older generation is very important. Just this week in class, we were talking about all of the like the Gen Z slang that they have come up with, and we'll talk about communication styles in a future episode. But I was like, your generation has replaced a 2-letter word with like a 5-letter word, and you all have like your own language that you're able to talk in, and it's impressive on one hand, but very confusing because I do not even understand any of what they're talking about. And so I'm like, do not use that language in the workplace because it's going to make you unprofessional or appear unprofessional. And kind of lead to some of those perceptions of people. Number 4 is to show initiative and have a growth mindset. I think that this is really important. Some of that is, the thought that Gen Z is difficult to work with because they don't want to put in the work and they don't want to take on new challenges. But if you can do the opposite of that, that can help go really far in your career and show that you're willing to grow and show that you want to learn. This is a big one. Number 5, avoid publicly bashing former employers. I think that as a Gen Z, part of that population entering the workforce, you need to be aware that everything you put on social media will be there forever in some cases, and that your potential employers are going to go look at your social media sites. And if you are bashing your employers, even on sites like LinkedIn, I've seen that happen a lot, or I've seen people comment on other people's like posts, or like will comment on a company's post and it's not positive. And I'm like, I wonder if they know that everybody can see, when they look up their profile, they can see that they're talking negatively about other companies. They're probably not going to want to hire you because they don't want that to happen. And then number 6, build bridges, not walls with colleagues. I think this goes back to kind of that social interaction and being intentional instead of just, staying in your own kind of bubble and not being willing to talk to people, but look at it as like your colleagues are there to help you, and how can you develop those relationships with them. So I thought that they had a number of good things that Gen Z could focus on to help them succeed in the workplace. But what are your thoughts on some of those?
I think Gen Z really has an opportunity to recognize that these perceptions about them exist, but then work to, as you alluded to, kind of like actively dismantle those perceptions, right? To be the opposite, to live it out differently. And I think that as you enter the workplace, you're likely going to be working with people of a variety of generations. And so whereas in school, you might have predominantly been around people your same age, or at least within a few years of each other, but very different in the workplace. And so some of these tasks or kind of ways that you can overcome these stereotypes really are going to require you to go outside just interacting with Gen Z, to build those relationships across generations. And to do that effectively, you're going to have to adapt that communication style. I see this a lot where people are trying to keep up with Gen Z slang, and I don't know, I think it moves too fast for people to keep up with, but it works the other way too. Like some expressions might have a different meaning based on generation. And I think about one example I've seen in the workplace is like, oh, this person's going to be out of pocket, meaning unavailable. But to a younger generation perceived that in a totally different way of what out of pocket meant. And so recognizing that there may be blunders like that, and maybe you can't avoid them all. You don't know what's going to be perceived differently until sometimes it's said, and then you realize, I meant this. What did you mean by that? Oh, it has a totally different meaning. Okay, now I know. But just recognizing that you want to make those connections, and those will be impactful for you in like a mentoring relationship or in career opportunities, career growth. Even people that are just coworkers, they may work on a special project and tap you for assisting them, or they may leave the company and, speak well of you if you interview at a different company. Like you never know who's going to impact your career. And so working alongside multiple generations will require you to adjust some things about yourself. It doesn't mean you can't be true to who you are, but like you're putting forth a professional persona. You're building that personal brand. You're wanting to be known as someone who contributes and someone who's easy to get along with and someone who does good work in order to advance your career, whatever that might look like. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities on both sides for both Gen Z and managers in the organization to recognize some of these kind of ideas or trends around Gen Z, but then to actively work to either reframe them or use them as a strength, or to recognize that they may not be true in some cases. And so when we talk about Gen Z in the workplace, there's a lot of opportunity for growth and development on both sides.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's all about just adapting to one another, but then also for Gen Z to realize, like, if I'm going to go into a workplace, I need to behave a certain way and I'm going to have to adapt my behavior maybe a little bit more at first, and then people can start to adapt back to me. It's all about, in any relationship, even at work, building that trust with one another. And so you just have to be mindful of it. And so I think we've talked about a number of great things of what both the company can do as well as Gen Z. So hopefully that'll help, kind of like the article said, build the, what did they say? Build the bridges, not walls, between all the multiple generations that are in the workplace today.
So listeners, we want to hear from you. How much should managers and coworkers adapt to Gen Z versus Gen Z adapting their styles to the existing norms in the workplace? So let us know in the comments. And we also have a freebie for you. If you're interested in learning how to manage Gen Z, we have a free quick start guide for you. You can access that in the link below the show notes. And that wraps up today's episode. So again, this is our third episode in our 4-part series about Gen Z. And if you found this information helpful, be sure to like and subscribe and to share the show. So you can also find us on Instagram or LinkedIn, and don't forget to grab your Managing Gen Z Without Losing Your Mind guide. So we're clocking out. See you next time.